when we were talking before, one of the points you made was that it's difficult for companies to move from an input-based to an output-based mentality. Do you want to just talk a little bit about your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, so this is something I've seen much more in practice than in some of the research that I've been doing. It's often difficult to get change implemented unless it's forced, externally, which is what COVID is doing. So often there's an awful lot of work that has to be done around figuring out how we're going to measure how a task gets done, and that's I can't really speak to the HR piece. The personnel piece is much more kind of your realm of expertise. But looking at it from the sort of supplier engagement standpoint, I think the kind of first phase of this was taking what would traditionally have been done in-house, where the only measurement for that is number of hours.
Yeah.
That someone's the actual performance during that time and how we measure productivity. I think we are getting much better at that. But typically, the unit of measure is hours worked, and then just taking that external and measuring that based on, that could be day rates, hour rates, whatever it is. So essentially you're taking a task that would have been done in-house and outsourcing that. And, I think there's quite a clear distinction in the US typically between sort of 1099 and W2, and you've got kind of a clear line between that. In this country, I think that's obviously been blurry for quite a while, and HMRC started to clamp down with the IR35 legislation and trying to narrow that down. But really, that's it's a good and a bad thing in a way, I think, because it's going to force companies that want to outsource by the task to start thinking more in terms of putting that into let's say a performance-based spec instead of a conformance-based spec. So that could be a statement of work, a service level agreement, whatever it's going to be, something where we're measuring milestones, measuring outputs, rather than measuring inputs effectively. But to go back to kind of what I was saying before, it's usually very, very challenging to get stakeholders to look at buying based on outputs, and until we start seeing the cost of labor, but the cost of that input going up without seeing an equivalent increase in the performance we're trying to measure. So that could be, for example, uptime on an asset in an FM context, or specific KPIs we're measuring around maintenance. But in a consulting or professional services context, that could be a particular success factor we're looking at for the business. So typically, a stakeholder will have a value driver they're looking at, whether it's operational, financial, it's some kind of strategic measure they're looking at, customer growth, whatever it is, revenue growth. And then based on that, they'll have a specific outcome they're looking for in the business, which might be an OKR or a kind of a success metric they're looking at internally. And I think, there's a growing realization that just having people work on a project that's trying to deliver against that aim for a certain period of time, that typically leads to cost overrun and scope creep. Whereas if we can nail down, okay, what are the specific milestones we're looking to achieve to drive towards the things that those stakeholders value most, those critical success factors, those OKRs, whatever it is, that becomes a lot easier to manage. And I think that for me is one of the realizations I've had, is that I think in a service context, procurement's role is much more about bridging that gap and realizing where and how we measure value from the supply market. Why aren't we doing this in-house? Why are we looking for specific expertise from the supply market, whatever it is? And trying to be able to bridge that gap goes a long way towards effectively marrying the internal objectives we've got and what we're expecting of the supplier. And that naturally evolves way beyond just measuring headcount, measuring by hours, by FTEs, whatever the equivalent might be.
So quick question for you on that. In terms of managing the internal objectives, when you have a labor-based situation, then do you think that requires the same clarity in what those internal objectives are versus when you're going to be outsourcing the problem?
Historically, I would have said no, but I do think that is changing. I think we see more and more. I mean, even in the last sort of 12, 15 years, like even since I've, been working on some of this, I think internally we see a lot more. You see a lot more delegation of responsibility to the employee from the manager, in the traditional sense. And there's a much greater expectation on the employee to take responsibility for achieving specific objectives. Whereas historically, I don't know, wasn't working in the 1960s, but I can imagine that, you wouldn't have seen that to the same extent that you do today. And I think that's largely because there's a greater, at least let's say in the West, in quotes, there's a much greater focus from an HR standpoint on creating a culture of autonomy where employees feel much more engaged, and they can connect the tasks that they're doing and the work that they're working on and project they're completing to specific outcomes for the organization. They feel a lot, a greater sense of engagement and connection with the organizations they're working with. I think that is changing and helping here as well. And that doesn't just stay within the walls of the firm. I think a lot of times suppliers realize that customer engagement, I think whether that's in a B2C context, or I think more importantly for what we're talking about here in a B2B context, making sure that we've got real long-standing relationships with customers is critical, because organizations typically spend a lot more to find new customers than they do to maintain their existing ones. The same thing's true from from a supply management or a sourcing context as well. I think when we realized that greater supplier engagement and having suppliers connected to the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and that can be incentivized as well. You can have performance-based metrics and even performance-based payment in contracts that align incentives. I think we're sort of seeing some of that same trend that I just described internally start to translate into supplier relationship management as well.